The theme for this year is Into the Deep. When Jesus had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep. Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Into the deep. And we are certainly in the deep of it. How deep? I'm not sure. I'm sure it's going to get a bit deeper. However, a contributor from the worship resource entitled Seasons of the Spirit wrote once that faith is the refusal to underestimate God. And I need to hear those words, especially in the moment in which we find ourselves. How about you? Faith is the refusal to underestimate God. In a world that is severely fragmented and even fractured, a world that struggles with loss and grief, a world that has been turned upside down by executive orders, we need a faith that holds tight to a God that does not leave nor forsake. In refusing to underestimate God, we are saying that God is present through the thick of it, through the deep of it. God is present, and I am grateful. If faith is the refusal to underestimate God, then the implication is such that God has done some amazing things. In what ways has God amazed you? In what ways has God been a buoy for you or even a life jacket? Clearly, God has done some amazing things through Jesus the Christ when it comes to teaching and evangelizing and catching fish. When Simon Peter saw the number of fish caught in the area of the lake, not known for its bounty, he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch they had taken. How did Jesus know? Or perhaps this was another example of faith and the refusal to underestimate God. In the late 20th century, archaeologists discovered a first-century fishing boat in the mud of the Sea of Galilee. It measured approximately 26.5 feet long, 7.5 feet high, and 7.5 feet wide, and then 4.5 feet high. A boat this size could accommodate a crew of 4 to 7 with sails or oars for power and a larger oar or sweep used for steering. In the first century, there were 2 types of nets used when fishing on the Sea of Galilee. The time of day decided the kind of net. The seine net was used for daytime fishing. The fish that the net encircled were trapped and dragged to shore. This type of net relied on a fish habit of trying to escape a net by diving to the bottom rather than swimming around the end of the net. For nighttime fishing, one used a trammel net. It is a type of gill net. By the way, I know nothing about fishing. I had to look all this stuff up. This net worked best in the evening because fish cannot see the web. Fish swim through the larger outer mesh and strike the back wall of the finer, smaller mesh. The trammel net is the only kind of net that needed to be washed. Thus the nets that Simon Peter was washing. So here we are, the Sea of Galilee, which formed a natural boundary between Galilee, which was inhabited by both Jews and Gentiles, and the largely Gentile territories of Galantis and the Decapolis. The Galantis and Decapolis territories were heavily urbanized by the Roman Empire, which changed the more traditional Jewish peasant, agrarian, and fishing life. When they came back to the shore without much of a catch, Simon, James, and John, probably welcomed to be amazed, though upon their arrival to the shoreline, their weary minds and their heavy eyelids and diminished bodies were more focused on cleaning up, going home, and going to bed. Being amazed, especially by the likes of Jesus, were not on their top priority. And yet, Jesus is hard to say no to, especially when he's climbing in your boat. Simon was a person who fished all his life. He knew which nets to use and when to use them. Jesus was a carpenter, a preacher, a teacher, a healer. What did he know about fishing? Simon used the trammel net instead of the daytime seine net. Simon answered, "Are you kidding? Jesus, we've worked all night long and have caught nothing. And yet, if you say, sure, we'll give it a whirl." And the nets were full. Several kinds of fish were commercially important during that time. They managed to catch tilapia and barbels, a part of the carp family, and sardines. Catfish also grew in the lake, but because they have no scales, they were not kosher and could not be eaten. Simon's first reaction is not amazement or even gratitude, it's shame. He starts to question himself and his abilities. He even deems himself unworthy by living and believing in certain expectations of what it meant to be a person who fishes all this time, especially a successful one. This moment changed everything. Why? Jesus invites Simon Peter, James, and John, the sons of Zebedee, into the fullness of who God made them to be. Jesus does not rebuke Simon for his inadequacies as a fisher, nor his character flaws as a quote-unquote sinner. Instead, Jesus invites Simon, James, and John to draw on their gifts in amazing ways. Jesus invites them to draw upon what they already have. Come and be yourself. Use the gifts that you have, and know that we might look at things a little differently, especially with God, through the involvement of God in your life. Simon Peter always had the inclination of proclaiming belief in Jesus through the miracles he saw Jesus perform. Then Simon Peter held himself to the same standard as Jesus, and Jesus would often get annoyed with this response. "Simon Peter, you be you," is what oftentimes Jesus would say to Simon. Believing in Jesus does not mean that you lack belief in yourself. Jesus wants followers to be empowered to use their supply of gifts in ways that bring God's love to life. Believing in Jesus is faith, and faith is the refusal to underestimate God. Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people. Jesus certainly had a way about him. He can be viewed as thinking like a person who fishes in determining the shape of his ministry. He made decisions based on where he would have the most chance of success. He went to the most repressed and poverty-stricken, those who were ill, demon-possessed, on the margins of society. He literally went to where the fish were. While the fishing culture is half hidden in the Gospels, it underlies the evangelizing strategy that Jesus employed. Sharing the good news has always been one of the missions of the church. Jesus seemingly made it look so simple by drawing in the crowd and moving people to be followers. In the life of the church at one time, it was simple for us as well. The church was the center of community. People came to the church because it's what you did, and sharing the good news was something that was done from the pulpit and in Sunday school and within the fellowship of the congregation. And we know that's not the case today. Culture is changing. People are making meaning in different ways, and religious institutions and bodies are not necessarily the centers of community making anymore. However, they are still instrumental in shaping a community through their message and outreach. Religious institutions in particular are being steeplejacked, and the push to become more exclusive is encouraged and maybe even becoming more required. And that's scary. And now more than ever, church communities, including ours, need to be very clear on how we do church, how we cast our nets, and how to read our supply chains and lean into the ways of doing things in the name of Jesus the Christ, because we too believe in Jesus the Christ. Because we too need to adapt. We too need to use the nighttime net during the day and the daytime net during the night to see, to experience, experiment, and most importantly, to meet people and their gifts where they are, because no matter who you are or where you are in life's journey, you are welcome here. Since faith is the refusal to underestimate God, then we know that God has much more in store for us, which is quite revolutionary. A few years ago, our conference minister, Reverend Sherry Pressman, shared her thoughts on why the church is revolutionary. She cited the work of Dr. Brene Brown. Some of you know Dr. Brene Brown. In her book, Dare to Lead, Brave Work, Tough Conversation, Whole Hearts, Dr. Brown was asked once about why she attended church. And she answered that it was the one place where she could interact with people who she would otherwise never talk to because she didn't like what they believed in or stood for in the world. Once a week, I break bread with them, she wrote. I sing with them, and I offer them peace in their lives, and I receive the peace from them because there's got to be somewhere and something that's bigger than politics, bigger than ideology, bigger than hate. Pressman writes, most of our congregations are not composed of members who all think and act in one monolithic way in the world. When we step through the doors of our sanctuary or meet online, we come to represent a broad diversity of opinions, politics, theologies, and experiences. But then we join our voices to utter that prayer Jesus taught us, spoken by generations of the faithful before us. We take time in the worship service to pass the peace to our neighbor and to receive a similar blessing or greeting back from them. We hear together the ancient stories from our sacred texts that reveal something about the nature and hope of God. We share our treasures to support our common mission, and we receive the simple gifts of Holy Communion that bind us together around one common table with the faithful across the world. In that one place, Pressman writes, even if only for a few precious moments, we transcend the things that otherwise divide us. We embody Christ's prayer, that we may all be one. We are countercultural communities who have chosen to grab a hold of something larger than ourselves and choose another way of being in a world that often stokes anger and fear and brokenness. Our faith becomes revolutionary. Our faith is the refusal to underestimate God. A couple of months ago, a friend of mine asked if her son could interview me as part of a Boy Scout badge requirement. They needed to meet with a religious leader about their role in community. And one of the questions that Jace asked me was, what did a typical day look like? Well, it's kind of my thought, too. It's not exactly the question I was expecting. And it took me a moment to respond. And my response was something like this. I don't have a typical day. Sure, I have a plan each day when I wake up and the daylight comes and what the schedule dictates. However, when the doorbell rings at church and someone needs a pastor to talk to, a conversation ensues about life, death, addiction, wanting to be seen and loved for who they truly are and meant to be, the need for food and gas, the need for simply being seen and heard. Now, this conversation might be followed by unclogging a toilet, changing out some light bulbs, having a conversation about bylaws, and then eating apple crisp with the Northeast seniors, and that's just the morning. What is typical is that God's compassion and grace are fully present in these interactions. However small and maybe even a little tedious, what is typical is the refusal to underestimate God. In a season that holds so much change and so much chaos, We know that God is constant and that God is inviting us to show up. We are being invited to be fully who we are, to use our gifts, and to be the church in ways we never imagined because the seas are different and deep, and the nets need to be used differently, and yet the message remains the same, that hope, faith, love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. When the church does more than just think of being a church building, when it looks beyond itself, it is truly revolutionary. It's beautiful, it's holy, and it's anything but typical. Who knew? Oh, Jesus did. And sometimes we just need to experiment with the nets to see what we get and to be affirmed that it is okay to think a